Well, let's get some more analysis now from Kristine Berzina, who is a senior fellow and head of the geopolitics team at the Alliance for Security Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. What's Washington's take on these, we assume, Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory?
Well, they're very important changes in the war because they are showing the fact that Ukraine is capable of not only trying to essentially catch missiles out of the air that are coming in Ukraine's direction, but that they are also able to try to stop attacks from happening against it. This is not something we've seen very much in the past, but it does raise a lot of really important questions about how the war can develop and to test some of the worries that NATO countries have had in the past.
And why do you think Ukraine is maintaining this policy of not taking ownership or claiming responsibility when it carries out such a strike?
There's always concern that to try to evaluate how will Russia perceive any next step in the war. There's been some discussion of this as an escalation, but I mean, I find that also to be somewhat problematic language. Russia keeps murdering Ukrainians, striking from within Russia, launching fighters up into the air, launching missiles, and striking Ukraine. And yet there's this anxiety, if you take responsibility, are you opening yourself up to significant counterstrikes for that? So there's this question of deniability, this question of leaving things slightly in the gray zone, because, again, drawing responsibility opens the question of counterstrikes.
It sounds like Washington's tiptoeing a little bit around Moscow by saying, well, we're not enabling these strikes. I mean, the language is there's a bit of caution in there, isn't it? And I'm just wondering why you think that's the case.
Well, it all boils down to, is Washington or other NATO capitals concerned about a strike against their countries? Should they be seen as assisting strikes on Russian territory? This is an underlying fear that exists in Washington and across many Western European and European capitals as such. What will Russia do in response if they feel that they are hit at home?
What's your reading of what the US strategy is, sort of medium term and longer term, with regards to Washington's involvement there in Ukraine?
Clearly, Washington is very interested in Ukraine winning, meaning pushing Russia out of its territory. So much of the focus of the kind of arms and assistance that have been given is to help Ukraine on the ground on Ukrainian territory, even that now taken by Russia, to push the Russian army back into Russian territory proper. That has been the aim of all of the weapons deliveries and the systems that have been selected to help Ukraine. But there have been limits on the kind of longer range weapon systems, such as ATACMS or Patriots, that could strike deeper into Russia. So the aim is to help Ukraine, but don't create a situation in which a NATO country could be struck in response. That has been the limit.
And just listening to what President Putin said earlier on today, I mean, he suggested this was going to be a long, drawn-out conflict, the like of which he probably knows the US general public, the European general public, grows tired after a certain amount of time. That seems to be his strategy, doesn't it?
That is. Putin would very much like to play the long game, and he is willing to expend the lives of his citizens, sending them to the front lines for what can be, in his mind, an extended duration. That, of course, depends, on the support of his people. He isn't exactly a democratically elected ruler. At the same time, there are also limits on his power. But his aim is to play a long game, which is where this question of what kinds of weapons Ukraine has, and is Ukraine enabled to bring this conflict more to an end, really why this is so important. Because if Ukraine had weapons that were able to strike out the supply lines, make Russia unable to sustain a long duration of a war effort in Ukraine, the conflict could perhaps end more quickly, and that could really be also seen favorably by people across Europe or the United States. But you have this tiptoeing over, well, whose weapon is it that hits something in Russia? And testing now, well, what is Russia's response? This is a war between Ukraine and Russia. And so it's natural that Ukraine would seek to defend itself by stopping the military effort against it. And it's notable that in these drone strikes, which likely were Ukrainian, although there's no official responsibility, these are military installations in these bases that are being hit, whereas Russia is striking civilian infrastructure on purpose. And so when we look at what is the nature of this conflict, I think it's important to understand it's one thing to defend oneself by striking military infrastructure that is hurting you, and a different thing on the Russian side of hitting civilian infrastructure, civilians on purpose.
And just going back to the strategy on both sides, I mean, we were mentioning there that Russia, Putin seems to be willing to play a long game there in Ukraine. That's a risk for him as well, isn't it, though? Because, of course, the Russian general public is also perhaps showing some signs already of really losing patience with this conflict.
Putin is working under an assumption that there are few other viable alternatives for leadership or power across the country, and that his people are fundamentally behind him. But this is a risky bet to make. We saw a tremendous exodus of potentially conscriptable men when the mobilization was announced. The full effect of the sanctions are only starting to be felt right now. So hardships on regular citizens are starting to increase. And the fear of loss of life and being implicated in this war is also increasing. We don't know how it might play out for the opposition to this war to build across Russia, but it's very much a serious possibility. And so, yes, of course, Putin may intend to play a long game. Will he be able to depends not only on the Ukrainian military effort, but on the tolerance and support of his own citizens.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. Kristine Berzina, the Alliance for Security Democracy of the German Marshall Fund of the US. Thank you very much indeed.